Our moderator today is Cheryl I. Harris. She is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Professor of Civil Liberties and Civil Rights here in the law school at UCLA. She's also the faculty co-director of their acclaimed Critical Race Studies program. Before entering the faculty ranks, she spent more than a decade in actual practice. And that included criminal, appellate, and trial work, as well as municipal government representation as a senior attorney for the city of Chicago. As the national co-chair for the National Conference of Black Lawyers for several years, she developed expertise in international human rights, particularly concerning South Africa. Professor Harris has authored several leading works in critical race theory, including the highly influential Whiteness as Property article that many of you have read in Harvard Law Review. Among many honors, Professor Harris has received the ACLU Foundation of Southern California Distinguished Professor Award for Civil Rights Education. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Cheryl Harris.
Thank you, Belinda, for a very generous introduction. I really appreciate the task of organizing a conference like this. It requires an investment of time, phone calls, emails, meetings, reminders, locating people, finding rooms, drafting, revising, arguing, making up, getting over it, talking, being silent, being flexible, being firm, being imaginative, and of course, being willing to take the risk of the enterprise in the first place, being willing to put aside all the other demands and concerns of the moment and taking the risk to just do it. In a lot of ways, one might say that the work of the conference required a lot of the same thing that coalition work requires, and that's in part what underlies our conversation this afternoon. Coalitions are hard work, really hard work, and really necessary work. Over 40 years or 35 years ago, Bernice Reagan, founder of the legendary women's singing group Sweet Honey in the Rock, and a longtime civil rights activist, put it this way: you don't go into coalition because you just like it, you do it because that's the only way you can figure you can stay alive. Let me read you a little bit more about what she had to say. We have pretty much come to the end of a time when you can have a space that is yours only, just for the people you want to be there. There is no hiding place. There's nowhere you can go and only be with the people who are like you. It's over. Give it up. Now, every once in a while, there's a need for people to try to clean out corners and bar the door and say, inside this place, the only thing we're going to deal with is X or Y or Z, and only X or Y or Zs get to come in. That place can then become very nurturing or very destructive. Most of the time when people do that, they do it because of the heat of trying to live in this society where being an X or Y or Z is very difficult, to say the least. The people running the society call the shots. They decide who lives and who dies. When society is being run that way and you are the one who could be put out to die, it's too hard to stay out there. And that's when you find a place, you come together, you see what you can do about shouldering up all your energies so that your kind can survive. But there is no chance that you can survive by staying inside that room. The door of the room will be painted red. And when those who call the shots get ready to clean house, they have easy access to you. But that space, while it lasts, should be a nurturing space where you sift out what people are saying about you and who you really are. You act out community. You pretend that your room is a world. Now that is nurturing, but it is also nationalism. And at a certain stage, nationalism is crucial to a people if you're going to impact a group. Nationalism at another point becomes reactionary because it is totally inadequate for surviving the world with many peoples. So the room may be a home, but coalition work is not done in your home. Coalition work has to be done in the streets, and it's some of the most dangerous work you can do. You should not look for comfort. Some people will come to a coalition and they rate the success of it on whether or not they feel good when they get there. They are not looking for a home, for a coalition, they are looking for a home. They are looking for a bottle with some milk in it and a nipple. You don't get a lot of food in a coalition. It's a coalition you have to give, and it's different from your home. You can't stay there all the time. So I offer these remarks as a way of sort of framing our conversation. Even though that was written back in 1981, I think it still resonates today. We know we need coalitions, we know it's risky, And we're fortunate enough to have today with us some of the people who can help us think through some of those tensions and some of those necessities. I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order they're going to speak. They're going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for conversation among them, amongst you, amongst us all. Scott Kiyoshige is an associate professor of American culture and the director of the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program at the University of Michigan. His fields of study are Asian Pacific American history, U.S. urban history, Los Angeles and Detroit, comparative race and ethnicity. He has a PhD from right here and a BA in Afro-Am from Penn. He's the author of the award-winning Shifting Grounds of Race, Black and Japanese Americans in the Making of Multi-Ethnic Los Angeles. The book won the 2008 Albert Beveridge Book Award from the American Historical Association for the best book in English on U.S., Latin America, and Canadian history. It also won an award from the Association for American Asian Studies. He's also co-author of, with Grace Lee Boggs, the legendary activist of the Next American Revolution. I'm so happy he just brought me a copy. I just cannot believe it. So, and he has for over 20 years experience as a grassroots activist and board member of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership based in Detroit. Andrea Benjamin is an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Department of Political Science. She teaches courses on race and politics, public opinion and identity. She had earned her PhD from Michigan, and her research interests include race, politics, elections, and voting behavior. She's currently working on a book that explores the potential for Black and Latino coalitions in local elections. Her research, among other things, examines how different racial and ethnic groups respond to cues such as endorsements in selecting or preferring candidates. Our next speaker is one of our own as well, Abel Valenzuela, who is the current chair of the UCLA Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano Studies. He holds joint appointment with the Department of Urban Planning. His research is primarily concerned with immigration and labor markets, secondly, poverty and inequality, and third, immigrant settlement patterns. He uses ethnographic, in-depth interviews, participant observation, and quantitative methods to document and explain some of the processes that we've been talking about all day. He has done really groundbreaking work on day labor work in the national context. It's become the touchstone for any conversation about day labor work in this country. Kealani Kaunui is an associate professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Wesleyan, where she teaches on settler colonialism in the Americas, indigenous sovereignty politics, and critical race studies. She holds a doctorate in the history of consciousness from UC Santa Cruz and a BA in women's studies from UC Berkeley. Her first book, entitled Hawaiian Blood, Colonialism and the Politics of Sovereignty and Indigeneity, an absolute must read if you want to understand anything about Hawaii. And her second book in progress is called Thy Kingdom Come, The Paradox of Hawaiian Sovereignty, which is a critical study on gender and sexual politics and the question of Hawaiian indigeneity. She's the sole producer. She's also a radio star. She's the producer and host of a public affairs radio program called Indigenous Politics from Native New England and Beyond, which is widely syndicated on 11 stations now, right? She additionally collaborates on another radio show called the Horizontal Power Hour, which features anarchist politics. She was a part of a 6-person steering committee that worked to found the Native American Indigenous Studies Association, and she was recently appointed as an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and we'll be back.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that generous introduction. So the title of my talk is Demography Destiny? And since Michael Omi already answered that question without giving a spoiler alert, I'm kind of not sure why I'm doing it now, but the subtitle is Ethnic Studies in the Obama Era. So I'm honored to be included in such great company on this panel. I'd like to thank Vice Provost Tucker and the organizers of this conference, especially Devin Carvalho for inviting me. And I have to say it's great to be back at UCLA because I certainly couldn't be doing what I'm doing today without my experience at this school. I entered UCLA in 1991 when the Rodney King beating and the killing of Latasha Harlins dominated public consciousness. Now I was born and raised in LA, so I was familiar with the city's diversity. What I lacked were the tools of analysis to make sense of it. And my first year cohort was in the midst of studying these events when the rebellion erupted in April 1992. Now, LA, of course, became the national symbol of multiculturalism as dystopia, and the right wing took full advantage of this moral panic. Whether analyzed socially, politically, or discursively, the situation appeared very bleak. But we have to look at that decade dialectically, for there was another LA, another California, another America taking shape right here. I mean, literally here in the Faculty Center, the site of the 1993 activist sit-in by the conscious students of color for Chicano and Chicano studies. But figuratively speaking, I mean, if you were a grad student studying race, power, and intersectionality, there was no better place to be in the 1990s than this campus and this city. And I have to thank the IAC in particular for supporting both my Asian American Studies master's thesis, examining the multi-ethnic dimensions of racist violence and anti-racist activism, and my PhD dissertation in history, which responded to the dystopian discourse of LA by focusing attention on the central problem of white supremacy rather than this so-called clash of cultures. Now, as I left Southern California and moved to a part of the country that has how should I put this, different take on diversity, I found myself developing a new argument. The uniqueness of 20th century LA led it to being largely ignored by US historians in the 20th century. This was my focus before, sorry. Yet these same qualities mandate that LA command serious attention from anyone seeking to understand the origins of 21st century America. Sorry about that. And so, as I rewrote the manuscript for my first book, The Shifting Grounds of Race, I focused on centering the margins, drawing attention to the history of polyethnic neighborhoods like Crenshaw to situate the struggles of Black and Japanese Americans at the center of LA's 20th century transformation from parochial and overtly racist white city into a cosmopolitan and multicultural world city. That's actually Crenshaw when it was a new white suburb. Scholarship and activism have always been connected in my work. I view ethnic studies as an academic project, but also a political project and an epistemological project. This comes directly from my training in ethnic studies, but also reflects its origins in third world liberation struggles that sought not just to write minorities into the textbooks and add touches of color to the campus landscape, but to transform and democratize structures of knowledge and power. Thus, my work emphasizes the connection between the production of knowledge and the construction of social movements. So when I look back at UCLA in the 1990s, it becomes clear that perhaps even more than academics, campus activism reflected the rise of a new majority. This is a photo of the late, great John DeLauro. Each attack on affirmative action, immigrant rights, and workers' rights prompted coalition building and movement building. We drew connections to the innovative multiracial community struggles arising from the global city, struggles for worker centers, environmental justice, and anti-imperialist solidarity, as polycultural trailblazers like Ozone Motley and the Black Eyed Peas provided a uniquely LA soundtrack. Though we often lost the battle at the ballot box, these campaigns established the new relationships, visions, and organizers that prefigured a different future. And if you look back at the debates and battles that defined USAC elections 2 decades ago, when a multiracial coalition of groups campaigned to dislodge the old fraternity-led machine controlling student government, you will see that these substantially foreshadowed the dynamics of the 2008 and 2012 US presidential elections. Now, California's diverse makeup no longer is the great exception. It's more embodied in, Obama's victorious coalition. It is the new paradigm. And after the 2012 election, a new catchphrase emerged: demography is destiny. Now, I have to note that the discourse of destiny is always problematic, racial destiny, manifest destiny, in ethnic studies. So actually, if you look at the numbers, the Pew Research Center notes themselves that they excluded American Indian and Alaska Natives and modified the notion of races. So the discourse is there, we have to deal with it. As we noted, it's having an impact. California's Democratic primary electorate is actually very similar to what the projected population is supposed to be in 2050, but it's a problematic discourse. And as my mentor, Grace Lee Boggs, argues, reality is constantly changing, so we must think dialectically. How do we make sense of the new opportunities and the new contradictions that are emerging in the Obama era? And here's where I want to pivot. Obviously, for some, this is a nightmare or even a doomsday scenario that prompts a reactionary yearning for a restoration of order. And in this regard, you can always count on a telling quote from Ann Coulter. More white people voted for Mitt Romney this year than voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980, she wrote. Fortunately, that's the end of the good news for her. If the same country that voted in 1980 had voted in 2012, Romney would have won a bigger landslide than Reagan did. Now, her explanation of how this happened necessitates forgetting everything you've ever possibly learned from ethnic studies. She writes, under Teddy Kennedy's 1965 Immigration Act, which Bill Longing was just discussing, our immigration policy changed from one that replicated the existing ethnic population of 1890 to one that strictly favored unskilled immigrants from the third world. Now, of course, it favored skilled immigrants, but again, the country would become poor and less free, but Democrats would have an unbeatable majority. Okay. So once Americans mislearned the lessons of history they were never taught in high school, Coulter's solution of restoring the nation's 1890 demographics makes perfect sense. So our first task should be clear. We need to move beyond simply accounting for oppression and resistance. We need to rewrite the whole of American history. How do we move from deconstruction to reconstruction? American exceptionalists declared American history began with the Puritan city on a hill. Revisionists shifted the focus to the first contact between Europeans and Indians. Critical ethnic studies needs to see the roots of 21st century America in the earliest maroon communities where Black and Native Americans found solidarity. And in the Blacks and Asians who fled slave and coolie ships to live among Latinos, and so on. So here's the takeaway. The important, groundbreaking studies we've been doing of comparative, interethnic, and transnational relations for the last 4 decades need to be taken to the next level so we can construct a new majority history. This is not something that we can do by hiding away in the archives by ourselves. We need dialogue, cooperation, and community engagement. And this conference, I think, is a step in that direction. But at the same time, we must appreciate that this shift from margin to center is fraught with peril. For every time there is an opening for marginalized subjects to gain mainstream acceptance, a new and sometimes harsher form of exclusion is constructed. The growth liberalism of the New Deal era gave rise to the white American middle class, but social programs routinely excluded or neglected people of color and were paid for with the spoils of empire. The liberal acceptance of a civil rights platform necessitated conformity to the anti-communist dictates of the Cold War. And now we've seen the Obama presidency advocate LGBT rights, place a wise Latina on the Supreme Court, and appoint record numbers of Asian Americans to high posts in government. Yet it's brought harsher forms of dehumanization in the form of drone assassinations, indefinite detention, and record deportations. And feel free to add your own disillusions with Antonio Viragosa here as well. So I will close with 3 challenges for ethnic studies in the Obama era. Now, Asian American studies was built on a critique of the model minority. And in the age of Obama, the model minority is not just for Asians anymore. You're all welcome to join us now. But we need to recognize how the ascendance of a new multicultural transnational elite is creating new forms of marginalization. Earlier today, the conservative governor of Michigan, I had to follow this online today, named an emergency manager to rule Detroit. Essentially an autocrat to assume the key powers of elected officials, as has already occurred in other Black majority cities in Michigan and school districts. This effectively strips citizens of the right to vote, and combined with the deepening effects of massive indebtedness and mass incarceration, basically sets us back to 19th century struggles over personhood. Number 2, even to the degree we move beyond exclusion, the multicultural paradigm, as Lisa Lowe has argued, is driven by the logic of differential inclusion in the age of global integration. So as you vote on whether the next Lay's potato chip flavor will be sriracha or chicken and waffles, remember to be critical of neoliberal strategies of accumulation that willingly accept and exploit difference and even celebrate diversity so long as it serves the interest of global capital. And third, we can't separate the fate of ethnic studies or communities of color from the neoliberal restructuring of education. Privatization, fee hikes, budget cuts, professionalization, and the gutting of the humanities and the arts and other fields deemed unprofitable. These trends have substantially overtaken K-12 education already and are making quick inroads into higher education. Ethnic studies has largely tooled itself to fight for legitimacy within the liberal academy. We need to be creative, strategic, and proactive lest we see our units disappear or perhaps even worse, be remade into something monstrously different within the neoliberal academy. These are big challenges. Fortunately, we are not empty-handed. We have a rich history to learn from and build on. We have connections to our communities to renew and strengthen. We have a treasure chest of theory and methodology. And we have some great folk waiting on deck to add their thoughts. So I will say goodbye now, leave the stage, and thank you very much.
Let me just say, this is part of a larger project. Obviously, I'm focused here on Blacks and Latinos, but my general thought is that a lot of the things that I'm going to say today have extensions and can be applied to Asian Americans. Perhaps there's a gender or a religious component that might matter, and we can talk about that specifically in the context of Los Angeles when I get to the end. So really, there's sort of two thoughts about Blacks and Latinos. One is that everybody's disadvantaged, so they should work together. And the other is, maybe not, right? And so we have some examples. Some of them are right here, Los Angeles specifically. So we know that in 2001, people who voted for Villaraigosa looked a lot different than they did in 2005, right? So 2001, 2005, same candidates, really different, what we would call coalition sort of behind him, right? So we could, think about that. But really, I'm just interested in this notion of crossover racial voting. That is, why do Blacks and Latinos sometimes vote for the same candidate in some elections and not in others, right? And so under what conditions can we expect them to exercise this sort of shared voting or shared support? Let me just say, we know a lot about racial voting, right? That is that, barring any crazy circumstances, in-groups vote for candidates from their own in-group, right? And so that's sort of been established. We also know a lot about cues, right? So partisanship is a main cue that people use. So, oh no, I haven't really studied my ballot, but I'm a Democrat, I'll vote for Democrats, people with a D next to their name, or oh, I'm a Republican, I'll vote for people with an R next to our name. But what happens when we don't have those cues, right? Or if we sort of buy this argument that maybe partisanship doesn't matter, and specifically in local elections, those cues don't exist, right? So really, what happens when your in-group, so we believe in racial voting, a lot of evidence to support it, what happens when your in-group isn't fielding a candidate? Do you still show up to the election with your low information and say, oh no, who do I vote for, right? So it could be that these sort of ethnic cues really provide that short heuristic for people. The other sort of important literature, a lot of which has its basis here in Los Angeles, Northern California, talks about sort of like how do groups incorporate into the government, right? So how do they sort of, olden times, how did sort of these liberal coalitions get into take over power from these conservative regimes, right? And so, here we would think that things like interest, right? So a shared sense of ideology or some sort of issue-based, or maybe even population size really matter. And so often I'm asked in my work, well, what would happen if Blacks endorsed a super conservative person? Well, I would say that the literature says, Black people wouldn't really vote for that person because there's not even a shared interest there, right? So the endorsement and the target don't actually match. So, and we could talk about that. And then finally, there's a lot of research actually, and people have talked about it here today, sort of, actually what really matters is how groups feel about one another, right? So to the extent that I have negative feelings about your group, I'm not gonna vote for a candidate from your group, right? And so those would be strong impediments, and then to the extent that actually I feel positively about your group, I might vote for a candidate from your group, right? So there's a lot of moving parts, and so hopefully I'll be able to sort of clarify them. But let me just say, I like to share these funny quotes about endorsements. Michael Bloomberg saying, I don't know what they are, right? I don't know what it means. And then in 2009, the Houston Chronicle had this to say about the candidates. They're not different. They have the same exact policy preferences, leaving voters to rely on endorsements or text to make their decision about who to vote for. So there we go. So I propose an alternative model. Again, no in-group candidate. Sorry, y'all. That's crazy. Sorry, so no in-group candidate, voters will look for heuristics, and again, context matter. And what I mean by context here, the literature talks about a couple different ways that context can matter, namely, sometimes it's through sort of excitement, right? So in 2005, or even 2001, as we looked at Villaraigosa, people were very excited. Oh my goodness, it'll be the first Latino mayor in 100 years, right? Or, oh my goodness, it'll be the first Black mayor, for different things. So that's one way that voters might think about themselves in an ethnic or racial sense. Sometimes it can come from issues, right? So if a candidate takes a particular issue position, we might think about something, racially or ethnically. And finally, it can come through attacks, right? And that's sort of a negative way. And so when in 2001, Green, the Democratic candidate, sends out a flyer that implies that a Puerto Rican isn't going to be good to be the mayor of New York City, right? Maybe it brings up racial issues, but it's in a negative context, right? So A lot of data like these don't exist, although at the end I'll tell you about my new exciting data collection. That's very exciting here in Los Angeles. But so I had to run a survey experiment. Hopefully people are familiar with these. Randomly assign people to treatments, and then given that the randomization, we hope it works, and then any differences that we see between preferences, if we can attribute them to the treatment and not to anything specific about the people. So Blacks and Latinos were asked to read 8 almost identical articles. Everybody saw Jeremy Boardman. Sometimes he faced Henry Brewer, a white candidate who is actually pretty liberal. Sometimes Henry Brewer had endorsements from either Black or Latino groups. And when we talk about highlighting ethnic issues, for African Americans, it turns out that Henry Brewer opposed something because it violated the city's affirmative action laws. Or for Latinos, it turns out that the policy violated an English, or it promoted an English-only policy that was illegal. For African Americans, sometimes instead of it's Jeremy Boardman and Henry Brewer, it's actually Jeremy Boardman and Anthony Gonzalez. And for Latinos, it's either Henry Brewer or Andre Jackson, right? So there's a lot of treatments. Hopefully we'll be able to keep them straight, but here's a chart. Right, so again, there's no affirmative action policy here. You can see that sometimes it's just Boardman versus Brewer, or sometimes Brewer has an endorsement, sometimes Gonzalez has an endorsement. Or when we talk about the affirmative action policy, again, it's similar. Either there's no endorsement, but the policy's there, or there is an endorsement with the policy. Same thing with Latinos, right? So now there's 16 treatments. It's a lot. I just got a review back that said it's too many. We'll talk about that. And again, just to be clear, there's this notion of racial attitudes, right? So I have my hypotheses. My hypotheses are about these treatments. My hypotheses are about the role that endorsements can play. But of course, oh my God, already out of time. Okay, so but basically there's these negative attitudes, or to the extent that they're positive or negative, they might help tell us when people would vote for outgroup candidates. Fine. So let me just say, so in the first analyses, among African Americans, just basic joint main effects, so endorsement only, Black candidate only, or racial salience only. The only thing that's sort of significant is endorsements, right? And so, but also this sense that Latinos face discrimination. So this analysis looks at people African Americans who read about the Latino candidate compared to those who didn't, and the sense that they face discrimination. So the general trend here is that as we feel more positive, we are more likely to vote for the outgroup. But here we can see that people who didn't read the treatment were a little bit more likely to prefer the second candidate, that is Henry Brewer, right, instead of Gonzalez, right? But once we sort of move to some joint effects where we add the endorsement, we can see that we can get a little bit more movement, even those with positive attitudes on the end, right? So those who read the treatment with the endorsement, a little bit more likely to prefer that candidate. Here we see that just having the Latino candidate without an endorsement and making race salient, we see almost the opposite, right? So that endorsement really helps, even when you have positive attitudes towards the outgroup. So again, if you read about the white candidate, almost, very likely that you preferred him. When you read about the Latino candidate without an endorsement, 50-50, okay? Again, with positive attitudes. The same thing here with the endorsed candidate with race salient. We see again, those who read the treatment, a little bit more likely to prefer that candidate. And here's sort of the most interesting thing. So it turns out that the interaction, so as I ran the analyses, you put the treatments in, put the racial attitudes in, put the interaction between them in. And it turns out that when we interact the endorsed Latino candidate with Latino competition, it is significant. And here's the only place where actually the more negative your attitudes were, you actually also voted for the Latino candidate. So we could talk about that. I am still working through that. Now, among Latinos, among main effects, just endorsement, just a Black candidate, just ethnicity salient, I get no movement, but racial attitudes also don't matter there. So really we look at the joint effects. So Black competition matters, and so we can look at what happens when an endorsed Black candidate, and then we look at Black competition. Again, we see that the no treatment is a little bit higher here, so maybe the endorsement isn't working as well as we think it should for Latinos. But when we get to the Black candidate without an endorsement, ethnicity salient, we see that it's reduced quite a bit, right? So even those who read the treatment, again, there's no endorsement here, and those who didn't read the treatment like the second candidate better, even with positive attitudes. But when we add the endorsement, we can get a little bit more movement. So even if you feel positively about African Americans, with the endorsement, you prefer them a little bit better. So again, this endorsement is doing something, but again, this is over racial attitudes, which also matter. So again, for the most part, how we feel about outgroups does matter, although the endorsement can kind of help. Fine. So let me just say this. So I'm collecting data right now in your fine city to sort of remedy this only having experimental data. Right, so we know that Jan Perry's running, Eric Garcetti, Oh, Jan Perry twice, darn it, y'all. Winnie Gruhl and Kevin James, sorry, that's totally a typo. As you know, if you live here, Jan Perry is black. She has a lot of black support in the early surveys. Eric Garcetti has become the Latino candidate, as it were, and he has a lot of support among Latinos. And so the survey question going out on the exit polls is, we, working with the survey firm, they contacted the campaigns, said, can you tell us who you perceive, or what organization you perceive to be your top white endorser, your top Latino endorser, and your top black endorser? They gave us that information. So it will be on the survey is, did the person you voted for receive an endorsement today? They might check it. And then how important was that endorsement to your vote today, right? So this is really the first data that looks like this. I'm very excited about it. And I do want to say I'm sad I don't have a lot of information about Asian Americans, even going on the survey, specifically because Garcetti has garnered so many Filipino endorsements. If I could have afforded it and had the space, I definitely would have included it. It's just a limitation at this time. And thank you.
Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this conference. It's very nice to be recognized, I suppose by your own, and I'm grateful for that. I spent more than a decade researching workers at the bottom of the occupational hierarchy. Let me underline bottom. Here I'm referring to men who look for temporary work on street corners, mostly Latino, undocumented, and weathered from searching for and working day labor. And by the way, a quick prop to the Institute for American Cultures. They were the first to support this research project as an assistant professor many, many years ago. My research on this topic has led me to look at other similarly marginalized, super exploited workers at the bottom, including, for example, women who disappear inside the homes to care and clean for others, invisible restaurant workers, those usually at the back of the restaurants who prepare, who clean, and who put together meals at fine dining establishments. Recently, I've spent some time looking at car wash workers who are forced to share their tips only, let me underline only, wages with management and with coworkers. Remember that when you get your car washed and only leave $1 or $2 tip to the guys who dry the cars. You should be leaving a lot more. Serious business here in Los Angeles. These workers share some key attributes, including experiencing high rates of wage theft, poor pay when they are paid, unenforced labor protections or no legal protections because some of these labor markets simply aren't regulated. They're not recorded by the state. These workers are also immigrants from Mexico, Central America, Asia, throughout the rest of the world. They're also increasingly racialized, often with their co-ethnic US-born counterparts, or lumped simply as Latino or Asian. These groups seem to carry a never-ending, in both a historical and contemporary context, a concentration in super-exploited, unregulated labor markets. These employment and other unregulated, cash-based labor markets seem to thrive despite their super-exploitive realities. In spite of terrible labor market conditions and labor market structures and processes that turn upside down our notions of hiring, of wages, work hours, fairness, production, and workplace safety, day laborers, domestic workers, even car wash workers are seeing palatable and impressive wage claim victories, legal decisions in their favor, back pay restitution, and a variety of other powerful and symbolic victories, such as a domestic Bill of Rights, that are earning them impressive and real victories. Superdiversity in California has contributed to labor market organizing campaigns that defy typical union or similar campaigns. They're astonishing for the simple reason that workers in the most exploitive and difficult to organize markets are registering victories. To be clear, inequality in work, and here I'm referring to wages, earnings, differences by gender and race, is profound, and I think deeper now than in any period in our history, at least according to many economists and social scientists. Union density continues to decline, wages relative to inflation continue to decrease, and we still have in place decrepit policies like the tipped minimum wage for restaurant and other tipped workers it remains as federal law, $2.13. Labor market conditions for recent arrivals in these types of occupations are bad, really bad, and I certainly don't need to convince you of that. But something is brewing, and it's real, and it's exciting, and it's impacting and empowering some of the most marginal workers in what is arguably one of the worst labor markets in our lifetime. Superdiversity in California has led to a robust and a still emerging and growing civil society infrastructure that has provided some of the most amazing civil rights and local labor market victories among immigrant and minority workers that are clearly part of a broader right to the city movement, an idea first proposed by Lefebvre to articulate more than just individual liberties, but access to urban resources, a common right to change and to use collective power to reshape urbanization, in many ways to remake our cities. Superdiversity has facilitated this melange of workers, organizers, community stakeholders, students, researchers, and others to win key victories, and by extension to create a snowball of sorts of similar labor market interventions. 3 key factors support this trend. The first, which many have already talked about, is massive demographic change, sheer numbers, and related immigrant solidarity. California is fundamentally different by sheer numbers among not only the 4 major racial categories, but especially numbers that describe the various ethnic groups within these 4 categories. There are not just hundreds, but literally hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans, Vietnamese, Koreans. They seem to be everywhere, because we are. And this diversity didn't happen overnight. It's been going on for many, many decades. And as a result, I believe, we have some very palatable changes that help explain some of the victories that I'm referring to. As an example, we have many, many educated immigrants, and especially children of immigrants, right? I recall a Vietnamese student, Tam Tran, visiting my office many, many years ago to talk about day laborers and other similar workers and how she might learn how to do research and other similar sorts of work that I do. The same thing with the Iranian American student who was very interested in Iranian settlement here in Los Angeles, a very important ethnic enclave here in the city of Los Angeles. They've since graduated. Tam Tran, we lost her. She was a dream activist. But many students like these have taken up really important positions, either in government work or in what I call the civil society, the nonprofit sector. As a result, I think we have really interesting types of organizing, cultural nuances that are embedded in how people organize. We have, for example, Oaxacan and other indigenous organizers who organize in much different, unique ways. We have organizers from El Salvador, for example, who have developed a niche organizing day laborers, and they very much use a Farian model in their approach. Female organizers also seem to be dominating many of these low-skilled immigrant markets. Indian women, for example, are some of the lead key organizers in the restaurant industry. So these, I think, really unique contours in organizing stem directly from these demographic changes in our state of California, and has also resulted in immigrant and co-ethnic solidarity. Many, many immigrants can't vote, but voting is just one process of political participation. Not clear to me that the power of the electorate moved Barack Obama, our president, to offer deferred action for childhood arrivals. More compelling to me is the organizing efforts, many of which originated here at UCLA to secure the president's action on this very important matter. The second, I think, really key factor to consider in these organizing efforts are the institutional partners that have been created among organizers and different community stakeholders. They're varied, they're sophisticated, and they're strategic. The research, the academy has had an important role in this as well. You now have many community-based organizations that rely on the data collection efforts of researchers, graduate students, undergraduate students. This has made a huge, huge impact at a very local level. We, I think, underestimate this very important role, but it has very high value. It's research that's engaged, that impacts public discourse, that impacts policy, and that has a focus on local interventions. Coalitions with organized labor are beginning to emerge among many of these nonprofit organizations, and that is in part moving what is a cash-based informal labor market, if you will, to the mainstream. The AFL-CIO is extremely powerful to this day despite union density. They have lots of resources, and these collaborations make sense for lots of different reasons. More importantly, I think the unions need this sort of membership for them to continue to flourish and build. Another example is the role of clergy. I don't need to tell many of you the relationship of religion among immigrants. It's central to their lives, to their settlement, to their nurturing, if you will. And key organizers have taken advantage and have organized clergy in this way. Elected officials and government workers is also really key here, right? So now we have the first, the second, and beyond generation of co-ethnics trying to make changes in much of government work. I often wonder if the attack on government workers, on government itself, on civil servants, on committed and hardworking individuals has something to do with the key inroads made by affirmative action in government jobs, right? These are jobs that are not occupied by many African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos. And yet we're always talking now about less government. These are jobs that people are criticizing. Public service is serious, and many in government want to see services strengthened in poor, minority, and in immigrant communities. Finally, we have civil society, the role of NGOs and worker centers. Many of these organizations are founded by, they're led, they're run by immigrants and or their co-ethnic counterparts. These are college-educated, social media savvy, social change entrepreneurs doing some amazing things in poor and minority and in immigrant communities. I think we have a very robust, but clearly we have much more to grow in regards to increasing the role of civil society. These organizations are creative, many of them are organic, many of them are undertaking amazing organizing with different racial groups, with leadership that oftentimes is not co-ethnic with the folks that they're organizing. As a result, you have, I think, some really interesting dynamics. You have very creative in-group processes to reach consensus, to focus on certain agendas and processes. Their coalition and their collaborations are savvy, and they provide an alternative to diminished government coffers, to, of course, diminished city services, and, of course, the ongoing fiscal federalism that we continue to experience. Superdiversity in California has facilitated, encouraged, and has made effective and real some of the impressive victories won by marginal, super-exploited workers. It is this broader context that contributed to the re-election of a Black president. A coalition of women, youth, immigrants, Latinos, African Americans, Asians, gay and lesbians that was, I think, strengthened in the re-election. It is also this context that our president touts as part of his own development as a community organizer. And that also led to our own students here at UCLA and elsewhere to change the conscience of the leader of the free world, to grant them deferred action on their deportation at a time when these students were embracing and appropriating a page from the gay civil rights community and embracing their illegal status and coming out by declaring themselves undocumented and unafraid. This is an impressive I think, stunning victory in what is arguably one of the most entrenched nativist periods in our history. Let's be clear, many of the immigrant workers who I just described, the students, and others in this broader immigrant worker rights movements do not vote because they cannot, but their friends and their relatives and their neighbors and their coworkers and co-students and their supporters and others do vote. They mobilize, they strategize, they make social change, and they're winning. Small victories, to be sure, that grow and lead to bigger victories, which lead to even larger and more impactful victories. These wins are palatable, they're life-altering, they're smart, they're impactful, and suggest a positive and real path forward that bodes well for our state, and by extension, I believe, for the rest of our country. Thanks.
Aloha, good afternoon, everyone. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I like to be at the podium so I can see who I'm speaking with, or speaking to in the case. I want to thank all the conveners and coordinators that brought this together, and also who brought me here from Connecticut. It's really great to be here. Mahalo. And that includes faculty, administration, staff, and students. I know it takes a lot of work to pull something like this together. Also, thank you to Cheryl for the generous introduction. And I also wanted to make a pitch. I did put out flyers on the back table for both the Indigenous Politics radio show and the Anarchist Politics radio show. There's a link on both flyers to the audio archive so people can check out past programs. I also just want to acknowledge that when Devin Carrado sent me the invitation to come here, one of the things he said in the email was, we want you to keep the difficult, fraught, and crucial question of race and sovereignty on the table. And that's how I took that cue as I pulled together my outline here, and that is a reference to the Race and Sovereignty conference that was here in March 2011 that I took part in, and had an incredible opportunity to meet with a lot of you, a lot of people who are in this room. I also just want to say, as a really short personal note, I was born in Sierra Madre, and I grew up in Southern California, so this is an issue close to my heart for many reasons, and I've lived in California all my life until I moved to Connecticut in 2000. My parents, my father's Native Hawaiian, my mother's white American from Pittsburgh, met in Pasadena at a party house called Steuben Street, which I heard was like the Islander version of Animal House. And it had its own version of sort of multiracial intersections. It was all young men that lived in the house, mostly of Japanese, Chinese background from Hawaii, as well as Samoans from Hawaii, and Native Hawaiians. And then, as my mother put it, the women that frequented the house, in terms of, they had these big bashes and they had dance parties. I asked her, I was like, was this all white women, hitting on these men of color? She said, no. It was a really interesting mix. It was Samoan women, Mexican-American women, and a few white women. And so that's sort of this milieu. And this Steuben Street gang, they now have anniversary get-togethers. Of course, they didn't reconnect for decades. And so I think it would be interesting to talk to them about what this 1960s milieu, mid-1960s milieu would have looked like in Pasadena back then. I too, like Mashana Goldman earlier, want to acknowledge the Tongva people whose land that we're standing on today. And part of that is about an ethics of engagement. It's also part of Pacific protocol for myself as an island person, to acknowledge the people of the land as much as we can wherever we are. And sometimes that's hard to do if we are speaking in, say, a state where people have been forcibly removed and dealing and reckoning with the legacies of ethnic cleansing. And I want to speak to this issue of indigeneity in my presentation today. But first I want to start with a quote by the late June Jordan, who was one of my professors at UC Berkeley. Quote, "In my pocket, I have 26 cents, 1 quarter and 1 penny, official American currency decorated by the Latin inscription, E pluribus unum. For a long time, I thought nothing in particular about that particular motto, from many, one. It seemed to make common sense, if only because I'd never heard any ideas to the contrary. But actually, that's a pretty dangerous notion, e pluribus unum, unless we're looking at strawberries and bananas and kiwis in California smoothies. From many, one could mean something awful, even horrifying state policies and beliefs. It could mean the Aryan race. It could mean ethnic cleansing. It could mean apartheid. It could mean the Naturalization Act of 1790, which decreed that only white people could become naturalized citizens of the United States. It could mean English-only legislation. It could mean I better forget who I am, who I really am, or why. It could mean I better identify with that dominant force. I'd better embrace and espouse that domination. But also, e pluribus unum is not God's truth or God's plan. How we got here as a species, for example, does not support that ambition, e pluribus unum. And in general, evolution flows in an opposite direction. Evolution flows into diversity by dint of infinite diversification. From the one, many, end quote. That's from a 1998 volume of edited essays called Affirmative Acts, and that particular essay is titled Bisexuality and Cultural Pluralism. When I see the word diversity, I always have I have multiple red flags. I think of it immediately in response to the displacement of actual discourses of affirmative action, and we've heard so many presentations that trace critically those histories in terms of diversity being used to displace those issues or to serve as an alibi in many cases. But also with regard to Hawaii, where I've had longtime ties all my life with my dad's side of the family, the Hawaii version is the multiracial paradise, the aloha melting pot. And that has never served Native Hawaiians, also known as Kanaka Maoli. That's always been dangerous. And the majority-minority question there has already been the case, right? Whites are not the majority in Hawaii. And to even sort of aggregate Asian ethnic groups doesn't work in terms of how Hawaii racialization works. That the way people narrate Asian ethnicities, they're narrated as though they're distinct racial groups. So there's this issue around race and ethnicity and how it plays out very differently in Hawaii. But I mention that just as sort of a different sort of point of reference in terms of that, because it goes back to the issue of indigeneity, which as an actual structural position, but also as a category of analysis, I find very few people want to seriously engage it, both politically but also epistemologically. And at the end of my outline, I do want to actually talk about it in relation to how we interact and how we carry ourselves. So in a sense, getting at some ontological questions around what I'd like to think about as radical relationality outside of the state as the primary point of reference. Indigeneity as a distinct category of analysis is not the same as race, ethnicity, or nationality, but it is shaped by all three of those things. And one of the things that I hope that the newly reconstituted IAC might think about as the sort of intersections of American cultures, American studies, and ethnic studies might grapple with is about how all the fields that fall under that might consider taking indigeneity seriously as a category of analysis and not relegating it to the Center for American Indian Studies. And again, that's because I'm speaking about it as a structural position, a social location, but also as an epistemological category and a category of analysis that implicates everybody. It's the question that never really goes away, and yet it's made invisible and it's erased precisely because of the demographic questions that, you know, it might acknowledge in passing Native Americans, but the numbers are so low that it's not taken serious. Native peoples, indigenous peoples, whether of the Americas or the US occupied Pacific, are not seen as robust constituents because of the low numbers. But also the issue around putting settler colonialism, relegating it to the past and not thinking about it in terms of it as a structural condition. And Professor Mashana Goman acknowledged the theoretical work of Patrick Wolf, who talks about settler colonialism and says it's not an event, it's not like an invasion, it's a structure. And that, if we take that seriously, we know that it's actually, we're living it. And so again, settler colonialism is that piece that interlocks with indigeneity. And the question around settler colonialism and that logic of the elimination of the native is always about a demographic shift, and it's always about land expropriation, right? So it's like what's going on in Palestine right now. It's the ethnic cleansing to sway a demographic proportion to actually try and expropriate indigenous people's land. And so part of this is, what does it mean to actually take settler colonialism and indigeneity seriously? We saw in the panels people really doing meaningful work in terms of trying to bust out of the black-white binary in terms of the dominant paradigms of racialization. And yet, again, the native piece falls out because I think people are only thinking of it in relation to actual numbers of native people, right? Instead of thinking about the fact that, yes, there is a binary racialization between black and white. We know that, for example, through the incredible work of Cheryl Harris in Whiteness is Property, that it is a binary racialization, that whiteness defines itself in opposition to blackness and black people, and that rests on the illegal and the human rights violations of black people, their bodies, and their stolen labor. But also in that piece, we know that the native land piece is also there. So people keep working within the binary of black-white, but the native piece always drops out, and yet you can't have that without the native piece. So that's a different kind of structural racial triangulation, if you will, right? We know from that work that white supremacy is based on the expropriation of native land and African labor. And so why does that drop out when people are trying to deal with binary racialization? And again, that's the structural question. If we take indigeneity and settler colonialism seriously, and at the same time, that also means that we can't look at settler colonialism and indigeneity opposite an analysis of race and the history, the legacy of slavery, right? And that's one of those things that was sort of one of the key tensions, I thought, in the Race and Sovereignty Conference, because one raises the issue of indigeneity and settler colonialism, and then you can have people from all different racial backgrounds starting immediately to try and say, well, hold on a minute, this is how my genealogy of how my people or how I got here, but not necessarily thinking about it in relation to another binary, which is the native, non-native binary, right? A binary that some people really want to insist upon, because to do without that, again, undermines the position of indigenous peoples in sovereignty and nationhood. The issue around indigenous peoples in California, I just wanted to add something. I don't want to repeat what has already been offered by Dwayne Champagne and Mashana Goldman earlier today, but I also just want to acknowledge some of the genealogies of how other indigenous peoples get here, besides the people who are indigenous to the place that we call California, including the early legacies of people crossing into these territories, but also through mid-20th century Indian relocation, and also that California is the prime state in terms of indigenous Pacific migration, right? So not immigration, although you have Pacific Islander immigrants who have no direct colonial genealogy with the United States, but you have, for those that come from US colonized places, this is the main spot for Native Hawaiians since the 1800s, and also American Samoans, Chamorros from Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, and then you also have Pacific Compact migrants, Marshallese people who are Palauan, people from the Republic of Micronesia, and those are all indigenous peoples, right? So the indigenous Pacific piece is another thing that often drops out in that ongoing struggle to disaggregate Native Pacific Islanders from Asian Americans, right? That's a long battle that I've been fighting for a couple decades, and you have the 2000 census being the first time that you have Native Hawaiians taking the lead to fight for that Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander category on the census, and yet because the numbers are so low, the census workers don't disaggregate the data, and they use the prior decade, and so they're always re-aggregating in order to show the comparison. So it's almost like it never happened, right? Which can be surreal in a negative way. The other part too that people have alluded to earlier and talked about in some specific forms is the fact that so many people coming from south of the US-Mexico border are also indigenous peoples from all over different parts of Mexico, especially in the south, and also, of course, throughout Central America. So you have displaced indigenous peoples who, are coming here by way of very different forms of imperialism, direct military occupation, economic strangulation. And I think that, again, this is another way to kind of rethink indigeneity past just one particular kind of purview on the demographic question. The other thing, too, just in wrapping up, is this issue of governance. The panel theme is on governance, and we had what I thought was a really productive pre-conference brainstorm on the phone, all the panelists. And I said pretty frankly at the time that I wanted to try and think about forms of governance that are non-juridical. But I also want to mention some examples that are juridical, and that's, my queer anarchist sensibility coming out, right? I want to think beyond the state. And that has to do with actually thinking through bottom line civic education needed around state and federal law with regard to tribal nations, right? The knowledge base is just so low for the average citizen or non-citizen Joe. And so that's one piece that I think is super important. And that includes making the distinctions and understanding the different legalities between federally recognized tribes and non-federally recognized tribes, as well as other indigenous peoples that come under U.S. imperial, very direct in terms of national boundary claims. The other thing around ethics of engagement is again this concept of radical relationality and thinking about where we locate ourselves and what does it mean to not know the history of the Tongva people, or to not actually have access. What does it take for that erasure to happen? And that, I think, is a social, sort of ethical question that many of us can be challenged by. I think it's a challenge, and I think it's a moral imperative, to be frank. Also, I want to just end with a few examples around coalitions, and these span different forms of governance, both juridical and non-juridical. These may or may not entail direct coalitions, and I think of a coalition as a very specific sort of political project that's more or less temporary. It doesn't mean that it can't go on, but that it's very focused around an end goal. And I think these examples for me really cross-cut race and indigeneity, right? And I think about race and indigeneity, again, as the distinction between sovereignty and civil rights, or sovereignty and civil rights with indigeneity and race as the counterparts. Which is not to say that indigeneity is not also racialized, and we learned that from the earlier presentations. A couple very quick examples. When I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act passed in 1990. And immediately, a group from Hawaii called Hui Malama Ina Kupuna o Hawaiʻine, Hui Malama for short, moved to reclaim Native Hawaiian human remains from what had just been renamed the Hearst Museum, from the Lowy Museum. And they wouldn't give back the bones. And the Hawaiian case became the very first test case of this brand new federal law. And I was working with Hawaiians in the Bay Area. We were doing sovereignty education for Native Hawaiian sovereignty issues in the late 80s, early 90s. And our elders, I was working with elders in the Bay Area, but our elders back home in the island said, if you do any work to support the struggles in Hawaiian land issues, you have to support the tribes where you are. And I was living in Ohlone territory in the Bay Area, the East Bay. And I went to try and learn more about that. And then we finally met with the Moekma Ohlone, for example. And they actually helped the Hui Malama group break through and understand sort of the flow chart around cultural resource agencies, basically harvesting remains that had been dug up by Caltrans, and how the money kickbacks go back to the archaeology department at Cal. And that was through Rosemary Cambra, who was of the Moekma Ohlone at the time. And she said, I'll help you. And then she explained the California federal recognition struggle, because over 30 of those tribes at the time had been fighting for federal recognition. And so that was one of those moments where, we went to the indigenous people of the land, and then they said that they would help the Hawaiian case. And then there was this ongoing relationship, an enduring relationship around the mutual politics of recognition. And it had to do with federal law, but it went so far beyond that, right? And then it just changes your whole way of thinking, because then you go back to the museum and you say, well, I've just been talking to the people from Moekma Ohlone, and they say, well, no, they're extinct. Well, no, actually, we just had coffee with them on the Alameda, right? And so this is one of those things. It's like, it just changes. Another flip side, though, of a a problematic example from another end is some of the Native Hawaiians in that community in the Bay Area, when they found out that the Presidio in San Francisco, that the lease was up, they wanted to go and get a Pacific Cultural Center, Hawaiian-centered, Pacific Islander Cultural Center on the Presidio. And you know, Spielberg ended up buying up all that, and there's this big studio and all that, but the Moek Maloney said, hey, hold on. The original documents all say when the military use is up, it reverts back to the original owners. And yet the state didn't recognize that because they don't have federal recognition. So again, the intersection of the state and federal issue, and then this politics of recognition and trying to work together and saying, hold on a minute, and then people who are sensitive to that issue, trying to educate in the community and saying, you need to back off. It's not actually okay for us to go in and do this cultural center. It's actually offensive to the people whose land we're on. And that takes me back to this local example right here, and then I'll wrap it up, which is the La Raza, La Plaza de Cultura y Artes in El Pueblo Historic Monument. And I learned about this case from Desiree Martinez, who's a Tongva woman who I interviewed on my show around what it meant that a museum in honor of Mexican and Mexican-American contributions in Los Angeles also entailed the unearthing of Tongva burials to make way for the garden site of the structure. That case is still in progress. The Department of the Interior weighed in. If you go to the website, at the very bottom of the website for the plaza, it'll say historic burial place, but it's not in the main part of the site. It's very, very minor at the bottom. You can go in there and read an update as of December 2012. And she's gonna meet me there tomorrow and give me an update. But I raise these issues because, again, it's that tension around sovereignty. And I hope that me bringing up these different kinds of examples, some from the early 90s and one right now that people are still facing here in their own homeland, really does also show that sometimes these issues can be really not around electoral politics, as important that they are, but then the endurance of what it means indigeneity in the 21st century for so many still is about this concept of the sacred, right? So there's legislation right now before the California State Assembly around actually involving tribes around sacred site and burial protection. That's being brought up by the Democratic House rep from Los Angeles. So to me, that's one of those places where people can step in, because it can be so daunting. You think, well, which tribe, and then there's a split, and da-da-da, but you can think about ongoing things in terms of ways to support that. And again, that gets right back to the issue of land and territory. And that's, I just want to say, it's California State Assembly Bill 52, sponsored by Mike Gatto. So I'll leave it at that. Mahalo.
Thank you so much for those very thought-provoking comments. I'm told by my boss here that we have about 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask one question of the panelists, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. So in the context of this framework of superdiversity, meaning the shift to majority-minority landscapes, although I want to thank those of us who've been talking about the complicated ways in which that may map over some important questions. I want to ask, does that negate or make it less likely for groups to engage in racial distancing strategies? And what I mean by that is, in the past, given the presence and sort of dominance of white privilege, relations among non-white groups have oftentimes featured positioning strategies in which the groups have sought to disidentify or distance themselves from groups that are racially targeted. So this gets played out at the level of the street. This can get played out at many levels. So, for example, some Latinos claim white identity as against blacks. Some blacks claim citizenship status as a kind of privilege over immigrant groups. Some Asians sort of distance themselves from certain kinds of racial justice initiatives under a model minority framework. So the question is, how does superdiversity change or affect this dynamic of racial distancing, if at all? Does it make it less likely, more likely, just different? Your thoughts? Not all at once.
Sure. I think there's a lot of creative processes going on at the street level, as you referenced in your question. A lot of the organizations that I've been privy to, that I describe in my presentation, are comprised of young, if you will, organizers. They have progressive politics. But nonetheless, I think there are really interesting strategic positionings that do take place, sometimes borrowing from, I suppose, older generational positionalities that occurred in the past. I think they're different in today's context. I do see lots of bridge building, both in terms of exercises and also in that day-to-day activities of their organizing. And they make great efforts to work together because they're winning when they work together, right? And so there's nothing more compelling than getting a victory, right? And learning from that and then moving forward in due course. So that's, I think, how I would probably make reference to that, that some of that occurs. I think it's different. I think that one of the big differences perhaps is that people move on, right? So if there's some group that you're working with and it's just not working out, you have this, if you will, competitive market to create another group and do your thing perhaps with another group or slightly different from that one group that you were working with. So I think there's a lot of that kind of synergistic wanting to work together, and if it doesn't work out, we're going to move on and create another organization, another sort of local movement, so that we can again ensure some victories, because it's nice to win. It's not fun to lose, and so I think a lot of that overtakes some of these positional issues.
Scott? Andrew?
Sure. I mean, it's a very complicated question. I'll just try to make one point. I think the changing class makeup of communities of color is really critical and something we have to recognize. Previously, ethnic leaders used to primarily come from the business, the sort of minority business class, right? That was the basis of having some kind of standing inside segregated communities and having to be able to be some kind of broker to the broader community. And then there was kind of the educated classes, and so there's the Du Bois, Booker T. Washington divide, but there was that sense that you were representing, the community. And the class makeup of who are these sort of ethnic leaders today is very different. Obviously, we see it in politics. There's a whole divide between the Coleman Young generation and now the Obama, Cory Booker, Adrian Fenty generation. So, I think there is much more of an open, fluid, professional class that people of color are entering, and I think, unless things change dramatically, will eventually become like the majority leaders of the Democratic Party and these other corporate institutions. Certainly the trend is going that way, but now the divide between that class and the structure that employed or the working poor is growing bigger, right? And so again, it doesn't mean we can go back to old models of civil rights or the talented 10th, but it means, like in Detroit, there was a model of community control, and voting rights, and we're seeing voting rights disappear, and we're seeing community control and sort of, autonomous rule disappear. So there's going to be a lot of tensions there, but they're not going to be the same kind of tensions.
Andrea or Kealani, you have any thoughts on this? No? It's okay.
Well, I guess just one thing that I wanted to mention. I think the class piece is so important and also so complicated, because then you've got just a multiracial super elite. There's the super diversity of the elite, but also within the groups, I'm thinking around the question around Islamophobia and the racialization and distancing that might happen with Christian Arab groups, right, who are marked in particular ways, and some of the issues that came out earlier around thinking through race, and also the question around that one of the early presenters talked about with regard to white and black Middle Eastern communities. So I mean, that's one of those things. I think the question around it being surrounded around white entrenchment is that whiteness is a moving target, a moving target in many ways.
Are there any questions, comments from the floor here? Yes, sir.
One question for Keilani. What was the name of those extinct people who were having lunch?
The Ohlone people, in this case, it was the Moekma Ohlone, O-H-L-O-N-E, and there's a lot of different specific Ohlone groups. And the Ohlone, there's Ohlone in Vallejo, there's Ohlone in present-day Oakland, and actually the Chicano in Oakland really stepped up around pushing on Occupy Oakland to recognize, decolonize Oakland, and did that with allies who were indigenous, who were not indigenous to the place, backing the Ohlone people going to occupy Oakland and saying, why are you talking about another occupation as your liberation when we're already occupied? And again, getting at a radical analysis, right? And the same with Occupy Wall Street. Joanne Barker's written about this with Wall Street itself built by the Dutch to keep out the English and the Lenape, and that Wall Street itself is about ethnic cleansing. And again, we know that Wall Street has all the African burials around slaves, right? People keep thinking that Native peoples are nitpicking at nomenclature, like it's like a politically correct kind of nitpicking, and it's actually epistemological. You can't look at corporate malfeasance in 21st century USA without looking at the roots of Wall Street that come at the expense of Lenape removal. I mean, you've got George Washington signing this treaty saying that Lenape will always have right on their land, and they're ethnically cleansed out now to 7 different places, 7 different tribes reconstituted, all the way as far as Canada. So yeah, the Ohlone peoples, I should say, because there's different groupings. But this case was the Moekma, and I can give you the spelling afterward.
Questions, comments? Are we tired?
Hello, my name is Sandy Gordon, and I just wanted to ask, what happens when these kind of white supremacist ideals appear in the academic settings? Like, for example, like me and my friends were both in the sciences, and we've been having these experiences with our professors, such as either, I guess, demeaning females in terms of that they can't, for example, what my organic chemistry professor had said, that we're not able to picture 3-dimensional structures, or it's a very huge challenge, and he has studies from Harvard and Yale to prove that. Or how he completely kind of isolated me with other males and say that, if I were Black or Latino, I would be offended by these affirmative action programs, and then go on to say how him and his African American friends were offended by that. So it's kind of like, how do students of color resist these kind of ideals, especially when they're from an academic setting and you kind of really don't expect that?
One of the best, I think, tools at your disposal is, of course, your education. And so I would probably advise you to graduate, finish your PhD, become a professor, and move on. That said, it's extremely painful and nasty when you experience these nasty moments in college. And so what I used to do is go hang out with my friends, talk about it, get some tough love, so to speak, and focus on my studies. I know it's an unsatisfactory answer, perhaps, but that's probably what I would have. That's what I did, and that's probably what I would advise you to do.
I guess I would tie to some extent the question to the challenge that despite the sort of changing demographics that we're talking about, there's an ideological structure of supremacy, white supremacy, that still is in motion. And so part of the question, I think, that's implied is, what is the relationship between this demographic shift that we're talking about and the fact that the same old crap keeps going on, to put it in academic terms. So, yes, in the back? Did you have a hand?
It's a question, yeah, is that okay? You didn't
Yes,
want us
please.
to answer that
Question,
question of yours.
comment.
So, this question is for Keilani. I really appreciated what you were saying about indigeneity being taken seriously outside of Indian studies as kind of a mode of analysis. And I wanted to ask you to say more about how, so you talked about a triangle instead of a binary, but you also talked about the possibility of two different binaries. And sometimes I think when I hear the indigenous, non-indigenous binary invoked, especially in the context of settler colonialism, that binary then happens at the expense of blackness. So the same thing happens to blackness in that conversation that you're saying happens to indigeneity in the black-white conversation. So I wanted to hear more about your thoughts about how to do that analysis without letting either one drop out.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's why we can't, this is the United States of America, we can't look at settler colonialism absent the legacy of enslavement. It's just impossible. And so to try and do one or the other is, to me, insufficient. But but the slavery question and the actual legacy doesn't ever make indigeneity go away. And that's the thing that drops out, right? So the native, non-native binary, the non-native includes everyone who's not indigenous, right? But analytically, I'm suggesting that it's a racial triangulation, and I've written a chapter of this in Hawaiian Blood because I look at how the technologies of racializing Hawaiians through a 50% blood quantum rule dictated by Congress that still stands today in 2000, 13. Native Hawaiians are still defined by a 50% blood quantum rule. And I look at the legacy of that blood quantum as being informed by the black, white, and native racialization that was going on at the same time in the 1920s in the Jim Crow era around the black one-drop rule. And work with Cheryl Harris's theory of whiteness as property, and to look at what's going on with Asianness, whiteness, and Hawaiianness in Hawaii at the same time. So for me, it's about the triangulation that one can't understand white supremacy absent nativeness and blackness in terms of their construction vis-a-vis settler colonialism and enslavement. And so I think that that's the key piece. But the question of indigeneity is one that exists even if there wasn't that. But I'm just saying that people keep trying to make it either or. So that's one piece of what I was saying. A different piece that relates to that was saying that people keep trying to talk about breaking out of the black-white binary and are always showing it's how much more diverse it always is, especially in a place like California. But natives always drop out of that because people are then switch to a demographic template, and indigenous peoples always drop out in the demographic template. That's the whole point of settler colonialism, is to reduce is the elimination of the native. And so we're reproducing that when we take this up, because it means that the indigenous stuff is not getting taken on board epistemologically. People then are not remembering the actual structural condition of settler colonialism that underpins racialization along with slavery. And that I was saying that part of that complication is because the black-white binary is a binary. You don't have a native-white binary, same racial binary. And that's because whiteness is considered to dissolve native ancestry, right? And so that's where you have the opposite racial, having to prove indigenous ancestry.
Could
Yes.
the two of us answer her
Please,
question too?
absolutely.
I was just gonna say, maybe this isn't.
This is back to the previous question.
Yeah, sorry,
Yes.
maybe this isn't super helpful, but I do take really seriously just my body being a professor on campus, and when my students see me, that I am not like my peers, right? I'm not a man. I am not 60 years old. I wear a dress, right? These are things that I take pretty seriously, and I mean, maybe this isn't the context, but I mean, I would say don't belittle you know that you're being disrespected, and I would say give power to that and find out who you can talk to if you need an ally, or there's an ombudsman on campus. I mean, this is real and it's structural, and if it's happening to you and it's so blatant as to say, oh, you students got here affirmative action, you can't do science, that's inappropriate, right? And so don't belittle yourself and say like, oh, that only happened to me. It's not only happening to you, and it won't go away actually, because then at every level, oh, I know why you're here, right? And so I would say maybe that's not helpful, but don't discredit the disrespect. It is disrespect, and you have a right to call it that, and to really take that seriously. And hopefully, I mean, I think Abel's advice is great. Prove them wrong. That is always important. But again, don't say, oh, it's nothing. It's not nothing. It is actually very much something. So,
I just want to, I just want to say, I want to just come back to just the point I was making that ethnic studies is not just an academic project, it's a political project and an epistemological project. It's political because we have to think about, like, why are people of color even on this campus? You know, before the Watts Rebellion, there were maybe less than 100 people of color in this entire university, right? And that was considered at that time to be a reflection of meritocracy and objectivity. You know, then Watts happened and rebellions happened all over the place, and within a very blink of an eye, there were, 1,000 people of color on this campus. I mean, there was a sense of responding to political moment, and then there was a political moment that people seized upon. The High Potential program was also the basis of the Black Panthers starting a chapter on campus, but that also got them killed too, as they were trying to create a very radical vision of ethnic studies, right? That's part of it. Even again, when I was here, ethnic studies centers were interdepartmental programs, some of them still are, but the departmentalization process hadn't happened, And so there was this nonviolent movement for Chicano studies, which led to a nonviolent hunger strike, which the chancellor described as they're putting a gun to my head, right? So that brings the epistemological point that when you when you expose that sense of, academia, when you expose the false universalisms, when you expose the false meritocracy inherent in academia by pointing out race, class, gender, discrimination, you get people thinking that, no, I'm an objective liberal thinker who believes in meritocracy. And so then that's why these things like affirmative action get, pointed out as, reverse racism or whatever. And that's why, again, the epistemological project is always, really, really central to exposing these false methodologies and false universalisms.
Thank you all very much.